The United Nations new production gap report shows that governments and fossil fuel companies plan to emit 110% more carbon pollution than can be allowed to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. To date, climate policy has focused on reducing emissions on the demand side and has left the issue of supply unaddressed. In this session, we'll outline the data that builds a case for a fossil fuel treaty and why dealing with the supply is critical for upholding climate health and human rights. So now over to my dear co-host in Dubai, Nick Nuttall, and his very interesting panelists.
Katerina, thanks a lot. We're moving from panel to panel here with large numbers of guests, so it was a bit of a rush just to connect through to this panel, but now we're all here, so it's absolutely fantastic. Joining me here in Dubai is Ariel, I'm going to struggle with this, Deranger.
That's me, yes.
How do you pronounce your middle name?
My full name is Ariel Tsekwi Deranger.
Okay, perfect. And she's Executive Director of Indigenous Climate Action. Yes. And Ariel is a long-time advocate for indigenous rights and challenges the expansion of fossil fuel developments in home territories. With her is Dr. Amira Sawas, Head of Research and Policy at the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. So great to have you here.
Thank you.
She is a feminist researcher and an advocate with almost 20 years of experience of working at the intersection of climate change, gender justice, public participation, and the social contract. And last but not least, we have Claire Fison. She's co-head of climate policy team at Climate Analytics in Berlin. That's where I live too, so I know Berlin very well. They have contributed to the UN Environment Programme's Production Gap Report. Thank you very much indeed. Why do I have two iPads? Thank you so much. Okay, so thanks very much. Let's start off. Claire, give us some headline main findings from the Production Gap Report 2023. What are we doing with this production?
Yeah, thank you. So in the Production Gap Report, a whole team of analysts from several different think tanks all scrolled through the production plans for fossil fuels by a whole series of different countries, 20 different countries, major producing countries, to look at what those plans would add up to. And what we found was that by 2030, there would be over 100% more fossil fuel production than we'd need in a 1.5 compatible pathway. So that's double what we would need to see. So obviously planning to completely bust through the 1.5 degree goal if those plans are realized. The gap is particularly large for coal, which is over 400% too much in the pipeline planned, and in the case of gas, 80% too much gas. Of course, those are just plans, so it's still up to governments to decide whether they realize those plans. And as part of this analysis, we also looked at what would be actually consistent with 1.5 degrees. And for that, we would need coal to effectively be completely phased out by 2040, and oil and gas to be together cut by at least 75% by 2050. And actually probably more than that when you factor in both the risks of certain technologies such as carbon capture and storage and carbon dioxide removal, which are also relied on to some extent in these pathways, but also when you factor in the dangers of fossil fuels. 7 million people currently die each year from air pollution related to fossil fuels. So when you factor those in, you need an even faster phase out. Yeah,
we just had somebody from the Lancet Commission Countdown, or is it the Lancet Countdown Commission? I always get confused which way around it is. Marina Romanello, and she was just outlining some of the figures in terms of the likely increased deaths, particularly in the over 65s, but from that. What about, we all know that all the reports are saying, right, Claire, that the International Energy Agency, so many others, there are business organizations here calling for the phase out of fossil fuels, not the phase down, and people are hoping that it might come out of this COP. Is that pretty consistent with your numbers in terms of if we want to deal with climate change, yeah?
Yeah, so if governments really want to get real about limiting warming to 1.5, they absolutely need to agree to phase out fossil fuels. We've been sitting in this process for years, and we haven't mentioned the words so far.
Yeah.
So it's clear that we need a commitment to be made. The IEA came out this year and said, actually, it looks like fossil fuel demand could peak this decade. So that's the first time that we're seeing that actually renewables could start to overtake energy demand growth and start pushing fossil fuels out of the system. And we recently did some analysis that showed actually with the acceleration that we're seeing in solar and wind in particular, they could already start pushing fossil fuels out as early as next year. And that would mean that greenhouse gas emissions could peak this year, which would meet a key IPCC milestone for keeping 1.5 degrees in reach. But of course, that's not guaranteed. Governments would need to stop propping up this industry and start really investing in the renewable energy system of the future. And I think what's critical is that it's not just a phase out in the very long term. We need fossil fuels to be reduced already this decade. We need 40% cuts this decade to keep 1.5 in reach.
Yeah. Can we get your perspective on all this? What does it all mean?
I think that some of the points that Claire has made are incredibly important right now. When we talk about states not actually living up to the commitments of meeting the decrease in emissions to meet the 1.5 goals with their continued investment in fossil fuels, we're seeing this even like where I come from Canada. I come from the Treaty 8 territories of Northern Alberta, where Alberta is dead set on getting every last drop of oil out of the ground. So much so that they are approving new projects at breakneck speed right now with massive investments into fossil fuels that are actually not just dangerous to my own community with the impacts that we're seeing from the fossil fuel industry, but we're also recognizing that this is contributing to the global climate crisis, and we don't have any plans to reduce our emissions in the areas of Northern Alberta. And this isn't just dangerous, again, for our own communities, but this is dangerous for everyone. We absolutely need to have a global demand for a phase out of fossil fuels, not just for human and Indigenous rights, but for the livelihoods of all people. And I think for me, one of the biggest challenges is we talk about needing to meet a reduction of emissions to meet our 1.5 goals, and yet we're developing things like Article 6 that are looking at carbon market mechanisms, which are actually not just creating a loophole, but are dependent on increased emissions to create an economic paradigm where they have emissions to continue to trade within these systems and structures. So if we need to phase out, not only for human and Indigenous rights in communities like my own that are seeing the impacts on the ground from fossil fuel expansion, and that's being exacerbated by the climate crisis, where we've seen out of control forest fires in our territory that are being created from a destabilization of our water table from oil and gas and exacerbated by climate change. If we do not have a phase out of fossil fuels as a global demand, this is a death sentence for communities like my own in Canada.
It's very, very interesting. And I spent some time in California when they had something called the Global Climate Action Summit in 2018.
I was there.
And there were so many people, Indigenous people, people of color, and who are living right next to oil and gas production, which had never, probably was once in the countryside. And the urban areas have moved in that direction. And the poor people are living right next to it, breathing it in every day.
Yes, absolutely.
It's absolutely shocking.
I think historically we've seen how the movement that really tried to highlight environmental racism in North America has looked at how we have historically seen these projects placed next to marginalized Black, Indigenous, people of color communities because it's out of sight, out of mind. In fact, in the early 2000s in Canada, the Minister of Environment said, we're placing these projects up north because there's no one up there, as if that we don't exist. And our community has seen the impacts. There's a community just about 200 kilometers from my community that is literally completely surrounded by oil and gas projects. The Lancet report really highlights not just those direct impacts from emissions and contamination, but that it being exacerbated by the climate crisis.
What about the gender aspect of this? Can you illuminate why we need this fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty from that perspective?
Sure. Well, if you look at the SDGs in general, we've done a study a couple of years ago which showed that all of the SDGs are actually under threat due to fossil fuel production. One of them obviously being gender equality. There's been a lot of analysis, and I reviewed a lot of the studies for the IPCC report on this, and typically you find, because of systems of patriarchy and inequality which are disproportionately experienced by women, particularly women from marginalized groups and living in poverty, those disproportionate impacts are felt, whether that's health impacts, whether that's impacts on mobilities, whether that's in disasters. You learn that, in many disasters, they disproportionately affect women because of things like the access to cash being limited or the social networks being restricted because of sort of patriarchal norms and standards. So, fossil fuels are threatening all of the SDGs. And when you do an analysis from an intersectional perspective, it's the same power dynamics playing out. It's effectively sort of the neo-colonial power dynamics playing out in a very concentrated and intense way because of the rapid nature of the impacts of the climate crisis.
This is all quite negative stuff, isn't it, that we're saying here? Where's this glimmer of expectation and that we can turn the ship around? I mean, renewables are doubling every 3.5 years. We're not starting at ground zero. Do you want to come in on that?
Yes, but I think what we have to do is address the structure at the moment, which is facilitating the continued production and investment in extraction infrastructure. So at the moment, we have subsidies globally. Last year for fossil fuels were over $7 trillion. The G20 earlier this year committed to increasing their investment into renewables, but they only committed to $4 trillion a year. So we have a major mismatch in priorities in terms of where the investment is being put. Now, there is, we're putting forward a proposal led by parties for a treaty where a fair, fast and funded phase out could be negotiated in a way which takes into account the historical factors, takes into account the power dynamics, which are impacting lots of countries' abilities to do a phase out. That's the biggest fear, I think, for many people, that we should be talking about a phase out in the COP space, but COP focuses on emissions. It doesn't focus on production. So how are we actually going to change the structural factors which are enabling this to continue at the moment?
Well, I mean, the COP focuses on emissions, but even that's not doing very well. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Because, I mean, we're talking about fossil fuels here, but we've got to think about land, and we've got to think of all the other things that add up to the emissions. And we're still way off on track on that. I mean, if governments were meeting and exceeding their Paris targets, we might be on track to handle all these multiple complex issues. Claire, I mean...
Yeah, I mean, what we have seen since Paris is there has been some progress. So we've been tracking every year, what do the targets and policies that governments have put in place take us to? And I think the policies in Paris were taking us to over 3 degrees, around 3.5 degrees. We're now more down to kind of 2.8, 2.7 degree territory. So there has been progress. And of course, if you factor in all of the net zero targets as well, you could get even steeper down. There is also increasing recognition of the importance of getting rid of fossil fuels. In Glasgow, for the first time, we did at least acknowledge that coal needs to be phased down. Of course, we need that to be a complete phase out. So there are kind of baby steps in the right direction. I think what's perhaps even criminal is that we have more than ever the information on what we need to do. We know exactly what's needed for 1.5. We need to phase out fossil fuels. We need to triple renewables. We're getting gradually on track for that. We need to double energy efficiency. We know the devastating impacts that continuing to burn fossil fuels, continuing to produce fossil fuels will have around the world. So we have all of this information available, and I think it's really up to governments to just step up and show that they are ready to respond to the science instead of coming here every year and kind of saying the same thing. So I think this is why an agreement here to phase out fossil fuels would be a really important step.
It's obviously, in the end, this is all about economy, invested interest versus, progress. And I was talking to Johan Rockström, the scientist with the planetary boundaries, and he's now at the Potsdam Climate Impact Research Institute, when I was queuing up this morning. And he was saying that he talked to somebody that said that during the COVID lockdown, the price of container shipments around the world went up 1,000%, and somehow the world didn't come to an end. You know what I mean? And surely, if people were really serious and really put a high price on, the carbon from fossil fuels, and there was a very, very high carbon price or some other measures, the economy wouldn't stop tomorrow. I mean, oil and gas the price of a barrel can go from $30, can't it, to 150, and the world doesn't come to an end. So in fact, we can start pricing this thing out. But I think governments are actually scared of saying to their voters, we are going to jack up the price of fossil fuels and da-da-da-da-da, yeah? But they need to bite the bullet, because actually the future would be better and more economically prosperous without them.
I think the biggest problem, in my opinion, is that a lot of the G20 countries are oil producing countries.
Yeah.
And this affects their personal bottom lines for us to talk about the phase out of fossil fuels. Like, I come from Canada. This is a very large oil producing country that has no interest, at least the province where I come from, which is the province for oil production. Alberta does not want to phase out of oil and gas at all. They think it's their right. In fact, we have an entire movement in the province right now to actually try to say that it's a violation of the Constitution for the federal government to enforce rules like carbon pricing and a phase out of fossil fuel. So when we have countries and states and colonial systems and structures that are continuing to push this as their right to be able to produce this and really continue to couch this crisis in an economic framework, then we end up in these debates about like how we can actually phase out of fossil fuels and usher in renewables. I think the other thing we need to be concerned about within this conversation is that we continue to couch this in an economic framework, and it continues to bypass the human and indigenous rights movements. And you ask, like, where is the positive in this? One of the things that I think is really, really incredible is that since the beginning of the UNFCCC processes, we have seen civil society continue to try to push for that human rights approach to ensure that states can't continue to just only look at the economic frameworks, because if we have a reductionist framework that looks only at emissions and only at the economy as a way to address this crisis, then we're going to continue to replicate those same systems of harm, even if we usher in and transition into a renewable energy economy. So while we're talking about phasing out fossil fuels, we also have to talk about, like, what does that look like when we phase out? Is this just, Shell and Exxon and all the big multinational corporations transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energy, which has in itself a lot of dangers and risks to replicating systems of human rights abuses across the world. So we have to look at this. And the beautiful thing that I've seen and participated in the COP system since 2009 is this increase of human rights and indigenous rights advocates and spaces. And we're not just here in the spaces, we're actually getting more voice, and we're getting more power within these structures. And particularly the Indigenous Peoples Movement is the second largest civil society group, second to oil and gas lobbyists in these spaces. And we have been able to really push the agenda forward to ensure that this conversation does not continue to be reduced to an economic and reductions of emissions conversation. And I think that's beautiful, because then it allows the conversations on the phase out of fossil fuel, gender justice, all of these things to continue to have that platform, so that as we move towards the phase out, that we're going to do it within a just framework.
Right. This fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, I mean, we're having various programs through the week, as it were, about it, and different voices on it. Just to get back to it for a second, why is it special? I mean, why do you back it? Why do you think it's a good idea?
I think it's a good idea because it's party-led, and civil society brings lots of energy and lots of solutions, and many of them drive the conversation forward, but we need political will. It's led by countries, started off with Pacific Island countries such as Tuvalu and Vanuatu, and has broadened out to producer countries, for example, Timor-Leste. We have 9 countries who've endorsed, and that's within a very short period of time. So there is political will growing, and it's set up by states that didn't necessarily drive the historical emissions trajectory. So it's an opportunity to rewrite the power, to say that the global economy and the system in the way that it's structured is not serving equity interests. And so let's start something, let's set up something and determine the framework and the structure in which we do it. Now, there's 3 sort of pillars of the treaty, and one of the most important one is a just and equitable transition. The truth is, it's totally understandable in many contexts, in many low-income countries, particularly those who have experienced colonialism, that they feel the system is structured in such a way that they can't phase out immediately globally. And the treaty proposal is not suggesting an immediate phase out for those countries. It's suggesting let's set up a framework where support can be given by countries who are rich, who have historical responsibility and who are currently producing fossil fuels, who need to stop. But they need to be providing support to those countries to make that phase out in a time which is in the interests of human rights, development, and sustainable development. And until now, that hasn't been a conversation in parties. There's been a lot of, I've sat in the negotiating room all of yesterday in the global stocktake, and the biggest challenge that kept coming up was around equity. How do countries like Brazil and India, many other countries who are producing coal, oil and gas, how do they kind of think about the future while considering the sustainable development needs? Now, firstly, as I said, fossil fuel production affects and threatens all of the SDGs, but we also need to provide support and structure and a framework to move things forward. And that's something that's being proposed.
Tell me something from the production gap report. I mean, this is not the first. There's been previous ones as well. I used to be the director of comms of UNEP, and I remember working on the original gap reports and publicizing those. Is there, when you look at these numbers that you're crunching, do you ever see any parts of the world or any countries in the world or anybody that's not, I mean, I'm not talking about the small islands here because they're not polluting at all, right? But any countries where you see, but they're not going up. They're actually, going down. They're not contributing to this 100% increase in production.
Yeah, so this year at the global level, I think what's quite disappointing is that the gap is still the same as the last report that we did a couple of years ago. So even though we've come forward with more and more NDC targets under this process, we've come forward with net zero targets, we still have the same gap, which shows that governments aren't putting those targets into action when it comes to their production plans. There are countries that have already peaked their emissions. Over 50 countries had done so by 2015, representing about a quarter of emissions today. There are a lot of countries who are kind of getting closer to that point. And yeah, I think that there are some really promising signs. For example, countries like Uruguay and Namibia have shown incredibly rapid uptake in renewables. Their renewables have grown actually at least at the pace that we would need to grow globally to limit warming to 1.5. So it's not just, a lot of people know that the developed world has so far managed more to reduce emissions, partly due to the export of emissions to other countries, but actually even in terms of their consumption emissions, those are starting to fall because of energy efficiency improvements, because of the transition to renewables. But it's also a phenomenon that we're seeing in the developing world as more and more governments realize that actually this does have benefits for sustainable development in our countries. There's benefits for energy access, for energy security. I mean, you mentioned the world kind of survived these increases in price over the last few years, but of course there are a lot of vulnerable people who've been hit hard by energy prices going up. Pakistan could no longer afford to import liquefied natural gas, for example, and a lot of people have been hit hard by the energy crisis in countries like the UK. And so I think we've seen our vulnerability to this volatility in fossil fuel price fluctuations, and that's yet another reason to make this transition.
Yeah. What happens from here? I mean, I don't mean particularly from this conversation here, but from this day, how do you plan to deploy your talents and skills and experience in the halls and the corridors to try and get what you want, or at least something a bit close to what you want from this UN climate conference?
I mean, I can start. I think that part of this work is I think this panel is a really great representation of the type of work that we need to do, is working within coalitions, understanding like that analysis, the science, the data, and taking it, having strategies that we can replicate at the global level that really focuses on the responsibilities of nation states, and then working at the sort of community level to ensure that we're upholding systems of human rights and Indigenous people's rights within the models that we are all advocating for, because we're all in the same team, and the work that we're doing also exists within its own different silos of work. And for me, like, I'm going to continue to work with Indigenous people people's movements globally and locally back home, but knowing that we are a part of advocating for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, that we absolutely need to demand our states participate in this, and that we absolutely need to be informed with good science and good data to advocate for the changes that we need for that just and equitable transition that we are asking for. And we have to absolutely look at those root causes of this, looking at the colonial structures and imperialism that have locked us into this crisis now, and how we can collectively work together with all of our skill sets to really combat not just the climate crisis, but the crisis that we're having within these negotiation systems of trying to separate us all and ensure that we're not working together in that collective movement.
I couldn't have said it better, if I'm honest.
Okay, we can just finish there now.
I know, yeah, we're done. Let's go.
You wrapped it up, you know. Unfortunately, we have a few more minutes.
Oh, really? I think for us at the Treaty Initiative, we are supporting parties who are interested in endorsing. We're talking to parties who want to know more about it, and we're building the evidence base. So particularly on issues like just transition, what are the principles of just transition? Obviously, this must be led by parties and their key stakeholders in civil society and science, but we want to facilitate and support that. So a lot of what we're doing really is building motivation and also a sense of agency around this, that it is possible and we can do something different and feel like there's something we can take out of this space and move the conversation forward in a very practical, action-oriented way.
And the production gap report, what are you doing with that?
Yeah, I mean, just maybe on the point of agency. So this recent analysis that we did that showed actually we could peak emissions this year, I think is a remarkable finding, actually. I didn't expect to find that. Yeah. There are a lot of ifs, you know, attached to that. Like, governments have to act. They have to continue pushing behind renewables. But I think we really want to get that kind of science-based messaging out, that we're kind of always looking to 2030 and 2050, but actually we can take actions this year and next that could already bend the curve downwards, so that we would be heading on track to our targets, or at least in the right direction, if not yet on track. So yeah, I think we'll really be here listening to what kinds of analysis are useful and trying to make sure as many people understand as possible what's needed for 1.5, and that it's still very much possible to do if we take the right decisions here.
One quick response to one thing. Some of the large private oil companies, of course, since the Ukraine war, have been running around the world telling everybody, you're lucky you've got fossil fuels because, you know, energy insecurity. And even the extent of selling the idea to Africa that somehow fossil fuels are really good for overcoming poverty, right? Yeah. Quick answer to this, because we've got 2 minutes. Is this really stupid or not?
It's incredibly stupid. I've seen it play out in my own community, that they've tried to push this into our community. It actually leads to a decreased quality of life for the people that are in those impact zones for the oil and gas. It creates inflation in localized economies, and it actually can create economic disparities as opposed to a solution to poverty. Yeah.
And also, I mean, climate impacts push 100 million extra people into poverty per year at the moment. That's, you know, the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees outcome will be that. Right. So more people are being pushed into poverty all the time. Right. And 1 in 5 people die due to, you know, prematurely due to fossil fuel driven pollution.
We say to people out there, don't believe the propaganda.
Don't believe it.
Okay.
Believe us.
All right. Thank you very much indeed for your time.